And you could really call, actually, this section of 1 Timothy from about chapters 2 through 5, church mechanics. Because it really is about the mechanics of how to do church. And the text we're going to look at tonight is not looked at very often. It is not only oft overlooked, but it's oft not practiced. And yet it's very important. It's very important in contemporary times. So we're going to look in the last half of chapter 5, or the first half, I should say, of chapter 5 tonight. Several years ago, it's a true story, in a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts, police found a 73-year-old woman dead on her kitchen floor. Now, that's not particularly unusual or peculiar in and of itself. Tragedies happen. But what was tremendously unusual about this case is that the woman had been dead for 4 years. For 4 years. How could she possibly have been dead that long and no one knew? Well, the woman's brother said the family had never been close and that he had not spoken to his sister in more than 2 decades. The neighbors all had an impression that she preferred to be left alone. In the end, it was just a sorrowful tale of people living in close proximity, but not in community. Of not really being a part of any kind of a family. And Paul calls the church the family of God repeatedly in his letters. And so this is the kind of thing that he says should never, ever happen in a church. So most of these verses in the first half of 1 Timothy chapter 5 have to do with the church's relationship with its older folks. Never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him respectfully as you would to your own father. Talk to younger men as you would to your own brothers. Treat older women as you would your mother. And treat younger women with all purity as you would your sisters. One of the great tragedies of our modern transient society is the breakdown of the extended family. You know, when I was growing up, which hadn't been that long ago, and many of you as well, sometimes families never moved from the neighborhood or the community where they grew up. But gradually we became, mostly because of transportation, we became a much more traveled society. There was a day when folks had a support system of friends and relatives that they could lean on during tough times. During transition or trouble, there was somebody they could depend on. When a baby was born, grandma would help. If financial hardships struck, brothers and uncles would pitch in. People had a social safety net. Today, folks bounce from city to city, state to state all the time and leave behind a number of scattered relatives. People are literally home alone. To quote the old movie about Kevin the kid left at home in New York City at Christmas time. On a daily basis, there is a vast lack of extended family or community. And that's why I think Paul's words are even more important and more valid today than they were when he wrote them. Because when he wrote them, people did not travel great distances away from home, usually never moved. All of the churches were centered around fairly small communities of people. And so the words we're going to read tonight was intended for them, but boy, do they really matter to us today. The church is supposed to act like an extended family. Older men, we read in verse 1, should be respected. They should be treated as fathers. They've earned that. They have a certain wisdom that can only come through experience. And before you rebuke one, remember it won't be long until you are one. And that's true of everybody. And then he said, treat younger men as brothers. You're a little freer to joke around with a brother, a younger man who is a friend of yours, or get in his face if you need to be. Every man needs brothers in his life. Brothers can do and do both. They can joke around, and they can also get in your face and be brutally honest with you when that needs to be done. The text says in verse 2, older ladies should be treated like moms. They should be loved on and appreciated. The older ladies of the fellowship have your best interest at heart. You rarely find an older Christian woman who's mean. I mean, I guess it's happened some, but I can honestly say not more than a handful of times the entire time I've been in ministry would I say I've known an older Christian woman who's mean. And then he tells young Pastor Timothy that he should treat the younger women as sisters with all purity. In other words, don't ever let it get sexual or flirtatious. Keep the relationships with the opposite sex familial. Young women aren't foxes or babes. They are your sisters in Christ, and they are there for you to protect. Now, increasingly in our society, we have seen older people being viewed as being marginal. I don't know whether you know this or not, but almost none of the advertising on TV is pitched to the older population. Almost none. Because they figure you already have your brands, you already have your desires, you already have your products, and so almost all advertising is pitched to the younger. The world is centered around younger people. The high value placed on youth has resulted in many people seeing the older population as irrelevant. In fact, I would suggest to you there are not many instances other than the church that sees the older community as relevant. In fact, sometimes not even the church. In Christianity Today, there was a story a couple of years ago about a church in Minnesota that made the news because they had actually asked their older members to attend another church for 2 years while they rebooted their church to the new and better church to reach younger people. And the message was clear to the older people: you are in the way of our church growing. Can you imagine any of those people coming back after 2 years? I sort of doubt that. So this text in 1 Timothy that we're going to read tonight, I promise you, is going to sound strange to our modern ears. Because we live in a day where there are life insurance policies, where there are investment portfolios, where there have been women in the workforce all of our lifetimes, where there is Social Security. Many of the problems addressed by Paul in this passage have diminished greatly. Many older women and even widows, and this passage is going to focus heavily on widows, have more in their portfolio in their life insurance than working people. They would be better off helping the younger people than the younger people in the church helping them. So I understand times have changed, but widows not only need help financially, and sometimes widowers too, they may need help in other ways, such as home and car repair, or companionship, or medical expenses, or certainly a feeling of being useful that all of life has not passed them by. And so what we're going to be doing as we read and study this passage tonight is we're going to be looking for principles that transcend the situation in the first century and that can be applicable to us today. That's where our focus will be. You know, the ancient world had great respect for those who had risen to old age. I'm not just talking about the ancient first century world in the church. I'm talking about all of the ancient world. Some of it still does. Old people are very revered in Eastern cultures. Very honored. Cicero once wrote, "It is then the duty of a young man to show deference to his elders and to attach himself to the best and most approved of them, so as to receive the benefit of their counsel and influence. For the inexperience of youth requires the practical wisdom of age to strengthen it and direct it. Aristotle wrote, to all older persons, too, one should give honor appropriate to their age by rising to receive them and finding seats for them, and so on. We have lost so much of that respect today. Even the one that Aristotle mentioned, there were times when if an older person came into a crowded room, younger people would be expected to give up and give them their seat. I know, because I was one of them younger people. If an older person had walked into where my mother and father was, particularly my father, if an older person walked into the room and there were no seats and I didn't get up, I'd get it on my seat when I got home. And now you just don't see that at all. There's nothing like that for older people, nothing like that kind of respect for older people today. People used to listen attentively to the stories their elders told. I can remember when my father had war friends. He served in World War II in Germany and in Europe, other parts of Europe. And I can remember when he had a couple of war friends that would come to our house. And it was in the 60s. And I was 5, 10, 12 years old. And they would tell stories. And they would send me to bed. And I'd sneak out of bed and go listen around the corner to listen to these fascinating stories these men of experience were telling. Now, the same kind of stories would be told and they would be greeted with an eye roll by much of the younger generation. Too often, the ideas of older people are dismissed as being out of touch. Maybe we would all be better off if we actually listened to those who have more experience than we do, because experience generally trumps education. It can be very, very valuable. Wisdom, as we'll be studying the next 2 weeks as a church in the book of Proverbs, is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 1:7 says. So, in fairness, this can go the other way. Anything younger people want to do sometimes is seen as foolish, and the traditional is guarded by older people against just about anything that might have a modern feel to it. That too is a lack of respect. So both groups, the older and the younger, need to have a mutual respect for one another in a family and come together with that kind of respect and evidence of it by their words and by their behaviors. The principle Paul gives us is that we should relate to one another in the church as a family. And speaking of God's family, there are certain people in that family who have greater needs than others. He goes on in verse 3. Take care of any widow who has no one else to care for her. I think it's, I'm not sure about the NIV, but I know in the King James it says, take care of any widow who is truly a widow. So, but if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and repay their parents by taking care of them. This is something that pleases God. Now, a true widow, a woman who is truly alone in this world, has placed her hope in God. She prays night and day, asking God for his help. But the widow who lives only for pleasure is spiritually dead, even while she lives. This is a very important passage for our application even today. Give these instructions to the church so that no one will be open to criticism, but those who won't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, have denied the true faith. Such people are worse than unbelievers. In the old King James Version, you remember it said, if you don't take care of your family, you're worse than an infidel. So, it's a very important passage to us, but we want to break it down and look at it from a number of different angles. A couple of women were once sharing a semi-private hospital room, and one was the wife of an Episcopal priest, and the other was a widow. And the two ladies had never met, and they were both just coming off of surgeries and then put in a room. In the evening after their surgeries, the Episcopal priest stopped in to visit his wife, and he came from the church, so he was still wearing his clerical collar, and they talked for a long time about the day's events and different things. Didn't do anything to identify themselves as husband and wife, had a very pleasant conversation, and as he was getting up to leave, he wrapped his arms around her and said goodbye and gave her a passionate hug and a kiss. The other woman who had just had surgery woke up from her anesthesia just about that time and saw that. And she said, wow, I've been a member of my church for 50 years and I've never gotten that kind of treatment. There were also a few women, some widows in Timothy's church who had never gotten that kind of treatment either. And they felt quite a bit slighted. And so Paul tells Timothy the church should take care of them. Now understand this, in the first century when this was written, men made up over 99% of the workforce. They just did. There were few opportunities for a widow to gain employment and support her family. So when a family lost the breadwinner, it was a big, big deal. Wasn't any Social Security, weren't any investment plans. It was a big deal. All she had to care for her was her family. Breadwinner's gone. It better be children or grandchildren or other relatives. And if not, it better be her church. Today, the church is still called to step in charitably, not only for widows, but I can't tell you how many different situations. Multiple figures every week of requests we get for help. Modern society today is so terribly fractured that many people have just absolutely fallen through the cracks. The poor and the widows and the orphans described in the New Testament, because all three groups are described as people the church should be interested in helping. The poor, the widows, and the orphans are now joined 2,000 years later by the homeless and the uninsured and the single moms and the victims of natural disaster like Hurricane Ian and others, and latchkey kids, and a society that has created a welfare system. So for a church today to function as a family, it has to be strategic. Just start meeting community needs with no discretion whatsoever, and you will absolutely bankrupt the church. You need a plan of attack. We have tried to do that here through a number of different ways. One of the ways we've done it is in our outreach to Potterworth Elementary School, the public school next door to us. And right now you have the opportunity to provide underwear. If you ever went with us over there sometime and went to the office when we did the Christmas project or some of the other projects we've done for them, you wouldn't believe the things you see. Do you know that inside one of the office doors, they have boxes full of shoes and shirts because some kids come to school with no shoes at all, and they have to take them in and find shoes for them to wear. Some of them come with no shirts or shirts that have holes in them, and they have to take them in. And that's an everyday thing. That's not just every now and then. That's an everyday thing. And so one of the things we've tried to target in our help to our public school neighbors next to us is like what's going on right now, the project with giving them underwear, the Christmas project, the others that we have done down through the years. All are targeted and planned, because if you don't have a plan of attack, you can be eaten up quickly. So the question all churches have to ask is addressed in this chapter in 1 Timothy, and that is, how far do we go to give financial help to needy people? And it didn't take Timothy long to discover two truths that all churches face when it comes to benevolent help. Whether it's with their own members or with people outside the church. And that is, we face unlimited needs. There is no way to even describe what the needs are that we face, even just in one local church like ours, among our members and people outside. But we clearly have limited resources. And when you try to meet unlimited needs with limited resources, discretion is an absolute necessity. And so in this text, Paul is giving Timothy and all preachers and elders and deacons and leaders principles for allocating aid to widows and to needy people. And I think the principles that I'm going to outline with you here that are in this text tonight apply to any benevolent situation in the church, not just widows. In fact, maybe less today than widows, because our society has picked it up with programs like we talked about a minute ago, with pensions and life insurance and Social Security and all those sorts of things. Still, the principles, I think, apply to any church benevolent situation. The first principle is clearly never contribute to someone else's irresponsibility. Like I said, the very first verse in this, in verse 3, he said, the widows who are truly widows. In other words, the ones that he wasn't talking about in a legal sense in that they've lost, all widows have lost their husband and they're grieving, but he's talking about the ones that also have no income, nobody to take care of them. And so he tells us in this passage some very clear things that you can do for them and some very clear things that you shouldn't do with them. And one of the things you shouldn't do is contribute to anybody's irresponsibility. In Paul's mind, a true widow who is a candidate for benevolence involved more than losing a husband. She had to meet certain qualifications. And the first one that he mentioned that we read a moment ago is, does she have any family nearby? The church is not a replacement for a person's own family. Paul made that very clear. We have a responsibility to care for family members in needs. Our parents sacrificed and gave freely when we were growing up, so we then turn around and become the parents to them when they are older and need it, and we don't just abandon them. Sometimes that's an overwhelming type situation. In some cases, people are not wrong to ask for help. It's not. Here's another one. Comes up all the time. I get this question on a fairly regular basis. Is it wrong to put an aging family member in a nursing home if they need extra care? And I'm telling you, it devastates some people with guilt if they ever have to do that. But sometimes there are situations where the care that a person needs is beyond what even the family member can give themselves. And sometimes there are extenuating circumstances too. Now, I didn't intend to get personal, but I will. When my mother got older and had Alzheimer's, she absolutely 1,000% refused to come down here and live with us. She was never going to leave Middle Tennessee, and she didn't want to go live with my brother either, and she simply was not going to do it. Nothing beyond physical force would have caused it to happen. She just wasn't going to do it. It wasn't our choice, it was her choice. Sometimes that's what you have to do. When Diane's parents faced the same situation, I was scouting out houses for them. And I came back, so were my two sons. And I came back one time and I told Diane, I said, we've got the perfect house for your parents. And her dad had been all along just kind of playing it along, not saying that they would, but not saying that they wouldn't. And her mother kind of was the same way, but not as bad as him. And so finally, God is my witness, I called him and I said, Ralph, I've got just the place and we can work all this out. We don't have to worry about the money. We know how to do it. And there was a long pause on the phone and he said, I'm going to tell you something that I haven't told anybody else. I'd rather die than move down there. Well, there you go. So what are you left to say then? Well, then I'm going to kill you. That's what's going to happen here. Because I'm going to make you do it. I understand there are extenuating circumstances in all kinds of situations. But to put them in a nursing home because you don't want to have to deal with them, now that's another issue. Paul is clear in this text. A person who is not willing to care for their relatives is worse than an unbeliever. One of the characteristics of love is a willingness to get involved practically with the needs of others, even if it means being inconvenienced. Here's a second benevolence principle that I take out of verse 5 in this text. And that is, the church should take care of its own first. The church's priority is to support people who are seeking the will of God before they attempt to help people who are just seeking a handout. There's a big difference between seeking the will of God and seeking a handout. Help a person who's dead to God and worships the idol of pleasure, and you may just be fueling their idolatry. That's what he said in verse 8 when he was talking about the widow who lives for pleasure. So you have to take care of your own first. The church is not to reward laziness or feed a sense of entitlement. And everybody who has ever worked with people in need in today's culture have had people ask for help while they were carrying the latest version of the iPhone and covered in expensive tattoos and driving a reasonably nice car, which may be all the reasons they need help. I mean, that's just the truth. And so there's a difference between what Paul is addressing in 1 Timothy 5 and what we sometimes see as benevolence in today's culture. And Paul said of that, a true widow, a woman who is truly alone in this world, has placed her hope in God. She prays night and day asking God for his help. But the widow who lives only for pleasure is spiritually dead even while she lives. Give these instructions to the church so that no one will be open to criticism. What is he saying there if we apply it in our time? The church will be open to criticism if you start giving handouts to people who are spiritually dead and live only for pleasure. Remember, we have unlimited needs but limited resources. And that will open any church up to criticism. So the church must take care of its own first, according to these verses. The next principle is, don't interfere with God's work in someone's life. Don't interfere with the character transformation God may be wanting to perform in another person's life. You know, some lessons I learned the old-fashioned way, out of poverty or bad decisions, bad choices, or pain from my own choices. Don't interfere with God's work. God uses pain. He uses situation to cause some people to change when they won't change because of anything else. Some of these true widows constituted an order, literally an order, a sisterhood of servants in the early church. Ladies with a lifetime history of good work and joyful service and prayer day and night, as the text said, were supported by the church so they could devote themselves full-time to practical ministry. Actually, the Catholic Church developed, which was the first break-off, from the church of the first century, developed the system of the sisterhood of nuns out of passages like this. And it was common in the early church for there to be this kind of orderhood or sisterhood. But this ministry was offered only to mature believers. We're going to see in a minute. Widows over 60 years old with a settled character who showed a pattern of good works. Now keep in mind, the first century, the life expectancy was in the low 30s. So a widow who was 60 years old, it'd be like today, a widow who's 90 or 95. Quite a bit different. But still, the principle here is we should not be passive takers in the body of Christ. We should all be looking for a place to serve. And just because you're a person in need, whether it's a widow or an older person or a person who needs financial help at the time, doesn't mean you should just sit back and wait for other people to help. Look for a way to serve. People who are facing hard times can still go and visit people. They can still go and pray. They can still teach a Sunday school class. They can still take a turn in the nursery. They can still be involved in one of the ministries at church. It doesn't mean just because you have needs that you have to sit on the bench when it comes to serving the Lord. That's the worst thing in the world for you. Serving energizes people. Serving restores hope. It instills value. It gives a helpful perspective. Every single time we've done a service project with Podorf, I have watched the faces of our people. The last one we did was the reading program about a month ago, and about 40-something of us went over there and read, and I watched our people's faces as they came out of the room, being with those children, some of which were difficult situations. I had 3 kids in my class that never sat down the whole time. They were just running around the back of the room the whole time. They've got such emotional and mental problems and needs. And the teacher was distracted with them the whole time. But still, almost everybody that we sent, that I watched come out of that room, did so with a smile and a feeling of energy, because serving energizes. When I've gone with some of you over to take the Christmas gifts every year, which is just an explosive thing. I mean, it's unbelievable when we take that over there. It's unbelievable how the kids feel, how the teachers feel, how we feel. Everybody that leaves has this wonderful feeling of service, because serving energizes, it restores hope, it renews hope. As a result of that, a couple of times ago when I walked in the school over there, 2 of the little girls in the back saw me and said, "There's the Christmas guy." You think that didn't make me feel good? Serving energizes and makes you feel good. It just does. And so when the hurricane then happened, something that almost never, ever happens, a public school principal and assistant principal called me to come over and hold a church service for them twice. To come over and hold a church service for them, for anybody who wants it. They could have gotten in trouble over that. A lot of schools have been sued over that kind of thing. Serving energizes. Here's the application for us today. When you offer benevolence, make sure you're not interfering with a lesson God is trying to teach the person who is involved in it. For instance, a widow who is put on the list for support must be a woman who is at least 60 years old and faithful to her husband. She must be well respected by everyone because of the good she has done. Has she brought up her children well? Has she been kind to strangers and served other believers humbly? Has she helped those who are in trouble? Has she always been ready to do good? There was a list. There was a list. Did she do these things? Is how you were qualified to get on the list. Is she over 60 years old? If she was, the church helped her. She in turn then helped the church. Don't interfere with God's work in someone else's life. And then the 4th principle is give God a chance to work through other resources. Well, what other resources? Well, he mentions them right in the text. The younger widows should not be put on the list, because their physical desires will overpower their devotion to Christ and they will want to remarry. Then they would be guilty of breaking the previous pledge. So the previous pledge is we're going to serve the church in order for the church to help us with income. And this would break their pledge. And by the way, would cause them a dilemma as to, do I return to a life where I had normalcy, where I had a husband, maybe children or grandchildren, or do I not? And if they are on the list, they will learn to be lazy and spend their time gossiping from house to house, meddling in other people's business and talking about things they shouldn't. So I advise these younger widows to marry again, have children, take care of their own homes. Then the enemy will not be able to say anything against them. In other words, if a younger lady under the age of 60 in this instance enters this order of widows, this list of widows, and takes a vow to serve the Lord full time in exchange for the church supporting her financially, what happens later on when she gets the urge to remarry? Suddenly, she's forced to choose between serving Jesus, that she is pledged to do, and following the natural and healthy desire to be a wife and to have a family. When people come to the church for help, they are usually desperate. And without realizing it, we can create in them an unhealthy dependence on us. Ask the government how that's worked out the last 70 or 80 years. The 5th benevolence principle is make sure your help is not really a temptation. That's what he just talked about in those 2 verses. Make sure you're helping them, not so they can then be lazy or a gossip. Maybe they lack the spiritual maturity of the true widows, the ones who are over the age of 60. But by taking care of her physical needs rather than her serving the Lord with her time and effort, we may have turned her into something God didn't want. Our benevolence may be playing right into the devil's hands. So let me just tell you something in case you don't know this. That's why our church rarely, if ever, gives out cash. We just don't do it. If the situation has been investigated, we might write a check to the power company, and we might write a check to a landlord, or we might hand out grocery coupons or gift cards, but not cash. We don't want to add to a person's temptation. Some people can't handle a couple of $100 of cash or $400 or $500 worth of cash. It never gets to their landlord or to their power company, and it ends up fueling an addiction and becoming an actual temptation to them. Now, that's not what I said, although that's what I believe. That's what Paul said, which brings up a sixth principle, and that is look for a long-term solution to situations. The long-term solution he's already suggested. Start a career or remarry a godly man. Of course, we don't want to grab the first guy that comes along, but she needs to be willing to trust God for the grace to start over. Unlike the older widows, the younger widows still have a lot of living to do, and they need to be open, he says, to the possibility of a new beginning, maybe even a second family. You know, there's an old saying that applies to a church's charity. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. But the overwhelming principle that Paul is using in this situation is encourage church folk to look out for each other. Remember, every church is faced with, and every individual Christian for that matter, is faced with two immutable facts. We face unlimited needs and we possess limited resources. So if the individual believers within the church can meet their own needs or meet each other's needs, it frees up the church's resources to minister in other ways. Remember that verse in the New Testament, James chapter 1, that says, pure and genuine religion in the sight of God and the Father means to care for the orphans and the widows in their distress, and refusing to let the world corrupt you. Our highest calling is to care for the lowliest among us in the church. So for many years here, we have had a widow's ministry. If anything, right now, we're strengthening it. We have always had a strong benevolence ministry. We've also had a ministry to people to outreach, but we do not let people just take advantage of us who only want a handout to the best of our ability. And we try our best to not let family members slip through the cracks, because love is every Christian's business. Hurricane Ian was a good example. We saw in Hurricane Ian extraordinary devastation from people within our church family. And everybody who asked for some help or who we sought out because we knew they needed it got help. Everybody. That's the goal. Can't always reach it because, once again, you have unlimited need and limited resources, but that is always our goal, as this text says.